April 12, 1945. The small German village of Wernigerode, nestled at the edge of the Harz Mountains, was eerily quiet as American forces secured the area street by street. Hauptmann Karl Müller of the Wehrmacht's 11th Panzer Division sat rigidly in a makeshift command post, certain that his American captors would treat officers of the Third Reich with the respect their position demanded. He believed the propaganda about the American forces, especially the Negro soldiers, being undisciplined, uneducated, and incapable of sophisticated military operations. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded over the next 72 hours would shatter not only Müller's understanding of his captors, but the entire foundation of racial ideology that had been systematically built by 12 years of Nazi indoctrination. The American convoy rumbled slowly through the cobblestone streets of Wernigerode. The 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the segregated African-American units of the U.S. Army, had been assigned to secure and process prisoners in this sector. Lieutenant James Wilson observed the ancient half-timbered buildings with their distinctive black wooden frames and white plaster, structures that had survived centuries only to witness the collapse of the Third Reich. Unlike many of his fellow soldiers, Wilson had a unique advantage. He'd studied German literature at Howard University before the war, spending a year as an exchange student in Berlin in 1937. "Hold position here," Wilson ordered his driver, Corporal Elijah Jackson. "This looks like their command center based on the communication equipment." The jeep stopped in front of a 3-story building with Nazi banners hastily removed, leaving only faded outlines on the stone facade. "Yes, sir," Jackson replied, scanning the surroundings for any signs of resistance. An experienced mechanic from Detroit, Jackson had picked up considerable German during his 8 months deployed in Europe, enough to understand tactical conversations and interrogate prisoners when needed. Private First Class Marcus Hayes, their radio operator, established contact with headquarters. "Checkmate. This is Rook 3. We've secured the village center and are preparing to process approximately 30 prisoners, including what appears to be senior officers. Over." Hayes had grown up in Milwaukee, where his parents, immigrants from Germany in the early 1920s, had spoken German at home. His language skills had initially been viewed with suspicion by military intelligence, until they recognized the invaluable asset they had in a black soldier who spoke flawless, native-level German with a Bavarian accent. The 4th member of their immediate team, Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, was checking his Thompson submachine gun while observing the sullen group of German prisoners. Reynolds had learned German while working as a jazz musician in Berlin's vibrant nightclub scene from 1932 until 1938, when the increasing Nazi restrictions on degenerate music and the dangerous racial climate forced him to return to New York. "Lieutenant, their commanding officer is requesting to speak with an American officer," Reynolds reported, nodding toward a tall German with captain's insignia who stood apart from the other prisoners, his posture still rigid with military bearing despite the circumstances. Wilson nodded. "Bring him inside. We'll use their command post for processing." Inside the stone building, Hauptmann Karl Müller was escorted to a small room that had served as his own office just hours earlier. Now Americans sat behind his desk, rifling through his papers and maps. The indignity burned, but he maintained his composure. To his surprise, it was a Negro officer who addressed him, something he had not anticipated. "Hauptmann Müller, I'm Lieutenant Wilson. You and your men are now prisoners of the United States Army. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, provided you cooperate fully." Müller raised his chin slightly. "I will speak only with a proper officer," he replied in German, deliberately ignoring the black man before him. Without missing a beat, Wilson responded in perfect, academic German. "I am the proper officer, Hauptmann. Your cooperation will determine how comfortably you and your men spend the remainder of this war, which, as you must realize, is coming to an end for Germany." The shock on Müller's face was impossible to conceal. His eyes widened, and for a moment he seemed unable to formulate a response. The Negro spoke not just functional German, but eloquent, educated German with perfect grammar and pronunciation. "You speak German?" Muller finally managed, his statement obvious even to himself. Wilson allowed a slight smile. Yes, I studied at the University of Berlin. I believe we may have attended some of the same symphony performances at the Philharmonie. I particularly enjoyed Furtwängler's interpretation of Beethoven's Ninth in the spring of 1937. The reference to Wilhelm Furtwängler, Hitler's favorite conductor, delivered so casually by a black American officer, seemed to disorient Muller completely. It contradicted everything he had been told about the intellectual inferiority of non-Aryans. Now, Wilson continued, we need a complete roster of your men, their ranks, and any information on other German units in the area. Muller hesitated, then slowly reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a folded paper. Our company records, he said quietly, his worldview visibly crumbling around him. While Wilson processed Muller, Sergeant Reynolds was conducting initial interviews with the enlisted German prisoners in the courtyard. Speaking in casual, colloquial German that he had picked up in Berlin's jazz clubs, he was gathering basic information while distributing rations. Name, rank, and hometown, Reynolds said to a young soldier who couldn't have been more than 18. Friedrich Weber, Schütze, from Dresden, the boy responded nervously. Dresden? Tough break, kid, Reynolds replied in German, referencing the city's destruction in the February bombing. How long have you been fighting? 6 weeks, Weber admitted, his eyes downcast. They pulled us from school directly to the front. Reynolds nodded sympathetically. You're lucky, war's almost over for you. He handed the young soldier a chocolate bar and a cigarette. Eat. You look half-starved. The small kindness and the perfect German in which it was delivered seemed to confuse Weber as much as the chocolate in his hands. He had been taught that Negroes could barely speak proper German, let alone show compassion. Nearby, Corporal Jackson was inspecting a captured German vehicle, conversing easily with a Wehrmacht mechanic about the technical specifications of the Kübelwagen they'd been using. The fuel pump is temperamental, the German mechanic explained, seemingly forgetting momentarily that he was speaking to an enemy, united instead by their shared technical knowledge. Yeah, we noticed that with the ones we've captured before, Jackson replied in German. You've modified the air filter here, though. That's not standard. The German looked up, surprised both by Jackson's technical knowledge and his language ability. Sand protection, he explained after a moment. Design from the Africa campaign. Jackson nodded appreciatively. Smart modification. Mind if I take a closer look? These interactions were happening throughout the village as the men of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion processed their prisoners. Each conversation that took place in fluent German created ripples of disbelief among the captured Wehrmacht soldiers and officers. By evening, the Americans had established a temporary prisoner processing center in what had been the village's gymnasium. The 614th was known for its efficiency, and within hours they had categorized all prisoners, provided medical attention where needed, and established a secure perimeter. In a small room that had been requisitioned as an officer's mess, Wilson sat with Reynolds, Jackson, and Hayes, enjoying their first hot meal of the day. You should have seen Müller's face when I mentioned Furtwängler, Wilson chuckled, spreading jam on a piece of bread. I thought he was going to faint. Reynolds smiled. The enlisted men weren't much better. That boy from Dresden nearly dropped his rations when I asked about his family in German. It's not just that we speak German, Hayes observed thoughtfully. It's that we speak different kinds of German. Jackson speaks technical German. I speak with my mother's Bavarian accent. You, Lieutenant, sound like a university professor, and Sarge here talks like he just walked out of a Berlin jazz club. Which I did, Reynolds laughed, just a few years too late. Jackson took a sip of coffee. My father worked alongside German engineers at the Ford plant. Picked it up from him. Never thought it would land me here. The question is, Wilson said, becoming more serious, how do we use this to our advantage? Intelligence has been asking for more detailed information about troop movements in the Harz region. These prisoners might know something useful. Hayes nodded. The psychological advantage is significant. They've had it drilled into them that we're inferior. Every time we demonstrate otherwise, it cracks their worldview a little more. Exactly, Wilson agreed. Tomorrow, let's pair up for the formal interrogations. I want to maximize that psychological impact. The next morning, the systematic interrogation of the German prisoners began. Wilson had strategically paired his German-speaking black soldiers to create the most cognitive dissonance possible among the prisoners. In one room, Lieutenant Wilson and Private Hayes were interviewing Hauptmann Müller and his executive officer, Oberleutnant Schmidt. Wilson conducted the conversation in formal academic German, while Hayes occasionally interjected in his native Bavarian dialect. "We're particularly interested in the defensive positions around Braunlage and Schierke," Wilson explained, pointing to locations on a map spread across the table. "We know the 11th Panzer had fallback positions established throughout the Harz." Müller remained silent, struggling with his duty to withhold information and the increasingly evident reality that Germany's defeat was imminent. Hayes leaned forward, switching to the familiar form of address and Bavarian dialect. "Du weißt schon, dass der Krieg für euch verloren ist, oder? Warum noch mehr Leben verschwenden? You know the war is already lost for you, right? Why waste more lives?" The familiar Bavarian expressions, coming from a black American soldier, visibly unsettled Schmidt, who had family from the region. How do you speak like that?" Schmidt finally asked. Hayes smiled. "My mother is from a small village outside Munich. I grew up speaking German at home in Milwaukee. We still make proper Weisswurst for Sunday breakfast." The mention of traditional Bavarian white sausage, a cultural touchstone, seemed to affect Schmidt more than any threat could have. His resistance began to crumble. "The defensive positions are undermanned," he finally admitted, looking at the map. "Mostly Volkssturm now, old men and boys with Panzerfausts and very little training." In another room, Sergeant Reynolds and Corporal Jackson were using a different approach with a group of enlisted men. Reynolds had brought his portable record player and was playing a jazz record, Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, while casually asking questions in the Berlin slang he had mastered during his years in the city's nightclubs. "This was banned as degenerate music, yeah?" Reynolds asked, nodding toward the record player. "But I remember packed houses at the Haus Vaterland when I played there in '36. A German corporal looked up in surprise. "You played at Haus Vaterland?" Reynolds nodded. "Trumpet. Not as good as Armstrong, but the crowd seemed to enjoy it, until your government decided jazz was a threat to German culture." The shared musical reference created an unexpected connection, and the German soldiers began to speak more freely, especially when Jackson joined the conversation with technical questions about their vehicles and weapons systems. "The fuel situation must have been difficult," Jackson commented in his precise technical German. "We've captured several vehicles modified to run on wood gas generators. Ingenious engineering, but a sign of desperate shortages." The German sergeant nodded reluctantly. "No fuel for weeks. We've been cannibalizing parts from 3 vehicles to keep one running." "Production capacity?" Jackson asked. The German hesitated, then shrugged. "What does it matter now? The factories in Wolfsburg were bombed in March. No replacement parts coming anymore." Throughout the day, similar scenes played out as the men of the 614th systematically dismantled the psychological defenses of their prisoners through their unexpected language abilities. Each conversation that revealed their education, technical knowledge, or cultural familiarity contradicted the racist ideology that had been a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda. By evening, Wilson had compiled significant intelligence about German defenses, supply situations, and troop movements in the region. But perhaps more importantly, he had observed a fundamental shift in the demeanor of the prisoners, particularly the officers. "Some things changed in them," Wilson observed to his colleagues as they reviewed their notes that evening. "It's more than just accepting defeat. It's like watching someone question everything they've been taught to believe." Hayes nodded. "My mother used to say that nothing destroys a lie faster than direct contradictory experience. They've been told we're subhuman, and now they're confronted with evidence that we're not just equal, but in some cases more educated and cultured than they are." "It's not just about language," Reynolds added. "It's about what language represents. Knowledge, culture, intelligence, humanity." Wilson considered this. "Tomorrow I want to try something different with Miller. I think he's particularly vulnerable to having his worldview challenged. He's educated enough to recognize the contradictions, but indoctrinated enough to be deeply disturbed by them. The next morning, Wilson had Müller brought to the command post alone. Rather than conducting a formal interrogation, he invited the German captain to join him for coffee. "I thought we might have a more civilized conversation today," Wilson said, pouring coffee into 2 cups. "Officer to officer." Müller accepted the cup cautiously. "Thank you," he said stiffly. "I was looking through your personal effects." Wilson continued casually. "I noticed you have a volume of Goethe. Were you a literature student before the war?" The personal question seemed to surprise Müller. "Yes, at Heidelberg. I was studying for my doctorate when the war began." Wilson nodded. "A beautiful university. I visited briefly during my time in Germany. I particularly enjoyed the view from the castle ruins." A flicker of genuine engagement crossed Müller's face. "Yes, it's quite magnificent in the spring." "Über allen Gipfeln ist Ruhe," Wilson quoted Goethe's famous poem. "In allen Wipfeln spürest du kaum einen Hauch." To his surprise, Müller continued the verse. "Die Vögelein schweigen im Walde, warte nur, balde ruhest du auch." For a moment, the war seemed to recede as the 2 men contemplated the poem's peaceful imagery and its promise of rest. "It seems strange to discuss poetry amid all this," Müller finally said. "On the contrary," Wilson replied, "it's precisely in times like these that we need poetry to remind us of our shared humanity." Müller looked down at his coffee. "How is it possible that you—" He stopped, seemingly embarrassed by what he had been about to say. "That I, a black man, can appreciate Goethe," Wilson finished for him. "That I studied at German universities, speak your language, understand your culture." Müller didn't respond, but his discomfort was answer enough. "Let me ask you something, Hauptmann," Wilson continued. "Before the Nazis came to power, what did you personally think about race? Not what you were taught later, but your own thoughts." Müller was silent for a long moment. "I had not thought much about it at all," he finally admitted. "It wasn't something that concerned me until it became part of every lecture, every newspaper, every conversation. And now, sitting across from me, speaking about Goethe, what do you think now?" Müller looked directly at Wilson for the first time. "I think I have been told many things that cannot possibly be true." It was a small admission, but a profound one. Wilson nodded and decided to press further. "Your forces executed black soldiers captured at Wereth in December," he said, his tone still conversational but with an underlying hardness. 3 months ago. They surrendered peacefully, just as you did yesterday. 11 men from the 333rd Field Artillery, tortured before they were killed." Müller paled. "I was not part of—" "I know," Wilson interrupted. "You were here, not there. But it happened under the same ideology that you've served, the same beliefs about who is human and who is not." Müller had no response to this. "We found concentration camps as we advanced," Wilson continued. "Have you seen what was happening there?" "We were told they were labor camps for enemies of the state," Müller said weakly. Wilson shook his head. "Systemic extermination, Hauptmann, based on the same racial theories that classified me as Untermenschen." The German officer stared into his coffee cup. "I am a soldier. I fought for my country." "As did I," Wilson replied. "But there comes a point where every man must ask himself what his country is actually fighting for." The conversation had taken a turn that clearly made Müller uncomfortable, but Wilson could see it was necessary. The cognitive dissonance needed to be pushed to its breaking point. "You know Germany has lost," Wilson said. "What comes next will depend on how people like you, educated, thoughtful people, process what has happened these past 12 years. Müller looked up. "What will happen to us? To Germany? You'll be processed as prisoners of war, treated according to the Geneva Convention. Germany will be occupied and eventually rebuilt, but first, there will need to be a reckoning with the ideology that led us here." "And you?" Müller asked. "When you return to America, will you be treated as an equal there?" The question caught Wilson off guard with its perceptiveness. "No," he admitted after a moment. "Not yet. We're fighting that battle too, although with words and laws rather than weapons." "Then perhaps we are not so different after all," Müller said quietly. Wilson smiled sadly. "The difference, Hauptmann, is that my country's founding principles state that all men are created equal. even when it fails to live up to that ideal. Your government explicitly rejected the very concept of human equality. That is a profound difference. The conversation had reached a depth that neither man had expected when it began. Wilson stood, indicating that their discussion was over for now. Think about what we've discussed, Hauptmann. Tomorrow, you and your men will be transported to a proper POW facility. As Müller was escorted out, Wilson remained at the table, contemplating their conversation. The war was nearly over, but the battle against the ideas that had fueled it, both in Germany and at home, would continue long after the fighting stopped. Later that day, an unexpected opportunity arose when division headquarters radioed that a high-ranking German officer, General Major Heinrich Vogler of the Wehrmacht's 21st Panzer Division, had been captured nearby and was being brought to their location for preliminary questioning before transfer to a more secure facility. Intelligence was particularly interested in Vogler because of his close connections to several senior Nazi Party officials and his presumed knowledge of last-ditch defense plans. Wilson gathered his team to prepare for this significant interrogation. "This is different from the local unit commanders we've been dealing with," Wilson explained. "Vogler is old guard military, but embraced the Nazi ideology early. He was decorated personally by Hitler after the France campaign and has been a devoted party member since 1933. "So, a true believer," Reynolds commented. "Exactly," Wilson nodded. "And he'll have been trained to resist standard interrogation techniques, but I doubt he's been prepared for us." Hayes smiled slightly. The psychological shock of educated black interrogators speaking perfect German. "Precisely," Wilson confirmed. "I want all four of us in the room, using different aspects of German language and culture in our questioning. Maximum cognitive dissonance. We need to break through his ideological defenses quickly, because we'll only have him for a few hours before he's transferred." Jackson looked skeptical. "Sir, with respect, someone of his rank and commitment, he might be more resistant to having his worldview challenged." "Or," Reynolds countered, "the higher they are, the harder they fall. If his entire identity is built around Nazi racial theory, then direct evidence contradicting it could be devastating." Wilson nodded. "That's what we're counting on." When General Major Vogler arrived under heavy guard that afternoon, he presented a formidable figure, despite the circumstances. Tall and aristocratic with iron-grey hair, he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to authority. His uniform, though dusty from transport, still bore the numerous decorations of a distinguished combat career dating back to the First World War. Vogler was escorted to the main interrogation room, where Wilson, Reynolds, Hayes, and Jackson waited. The German general's eyes widened momentarily at the sight of four black officers, but he quickly composed himself and took the offered seat with rigid dignity. "General Major Vogler," Wilson began in his perfect academic German, "I am Lieutenant Wilson. These are Sergeant Reynolds, Corporal Jackson, and Private Hayes. We will be conducting your preliminary interrogation before your transfer to division headquarters." Vogler's face remained impassive, but a muscle twitched near his eye, the only indication of his surprise at Wilson's flawless German. "I'm required to give only my name, rank, and identification number," Vogler stated coldly. "According to the Geneva Convention." "That is correct," Wilson acknowledged. "Heinrich Vogler, General Major, identification number 27891. Now that we've established that, perhaps we can have a more productive conversation." Vogler's eyes narrowed. "I have nothing to say to you." Hayes leaned forward, addressing Vogler in his native Bavarian dialect. "Is that how a Bavarian officer shows his manners, Herr General? My mother would be quite disappointed in your hospitality." The regional dialect seemed to startle Vogler more than Wilson's perfect High German had. His composure cracked slightly. "You speak Bavarian?" he asked despite himself. "Born in Munich," Hayes replied, continuing in dialect. "Though I've lived in America since I was a child. But we maintained the proper traditions at home." Reynolds casually placed a record on the player in the corner, and the room filled with the sophisticated piano melody of Bach's Goldberg Variations, performed by the renowned German pianist Wilhelm Kempff. "I attended this performance in Berlin, 1935, Reynolds commented. "The Philharmonie was completely silent during the aria. You could hear every nuance. Vogler's eyes darted between the four black Americans, each demonstration of German linguistic ability and cultural knowledge visibly unsettling him. Jackson added to the general's discomfort by commenting on the technical specifications of the German Tiger tanks that Vogler's division had commanded, using precise engineering terminology that revealed deep technical knowledge. The overlapping wheel design was innovative but proved problematic in the Eastern Front's muddy conditions, Jackson noted. Our intelligence shows your division lost more tanks to mechanical failures than to enemy fire in the Ukraine campaign. Vogler stared at him, clearly disturbed by this accurate assessment, delivered in perfect technical German. Wilson watched the general's growing discomfort with satisfaction. Their strategy was working. Vogler's worldview was being challenged not through argument, but through the irrefutable evidence of their existence as educated, cultured men who defied every stereotype of Nazi racial theory. "Let's speak frankly, General Major," Wilson said, shifting the conversation. "Germany has lost the war. Berlin will fall within weeks, if not days. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich has lasted barely a decade. The question now is not whether Germany will surrender, but how many more Germans will die unnecessarily before that happens." Vogler's face hardened. "Germany will never—" "Please," Wilson interrupted, "spare us the propaganda. You're a military strategist of considerable experience. You know the production numbers as well as I do. In 1944, America produced more aircraft in a single month than Germany did in the entire year. Our factories are untouched by bombing. Our supply lines are secure. Our troops are well-fed and well-equipped. Meanwhile, boys and old men are defending your cities with Panzerfausts against Sherman tanks." The statistical reality, delivered matter-of-factly by a black officer, seemed to affect Vogler deeply. For a military man who understood logistics and industrial capacity, these facts were impossible to dispute. "Why are we having this conversation?" Vogler finally asked, his tone less certain than before. "Because you have information that could save lives." "German lives," and Wilson replied. "Defense plans for the remaining Harz Mountain positions, the locations of last-stand SS units that might fight to the death unnecessarily." "You expect me to betray my oath?" Vogler asked, though his question lacked conviction. "I expect you to recognize reality," Wilson answered, "and to consider what serving Germany truly means at this moment in history. Is it following the orders of a failing regime to the bitter end, or is it helping to ensure that Germany has a future after this war?" Hayes added quietly, still in his Bavarian dialect. "My mother's family is from Berchtesgaden. I still have cousins there if they've survived. When I think about Germany, I think about them, not about ideologies or governments." The personal connections seemed to affect Vogler unexpectedly. For the first time, he truly looked at Hayes, seeing not just a black American soldier, but someone with a genuine connection to the German homeland. "Your mother is German?" he asked. Hayes nodded. "Immigrated in 1919 after the First War. Married my father in Milwaukee in 1922, but she kept Bavaria alive in our home. The language, the food, the music, the stories." Reynolds changed the record, this time to a traditional Bavarian folk song. The familiar melody filled the room, and Hayes began to hum along quietly. Something in Vogler seemed to crack at this moment, as if the accumulated contradictions to his worldview had finally reached a breaking point. The ideology that had classified these men as subhuman could not be reconciled with their evident humanity, intelligence, and even shared cultural connections. "What would you like to know?" Vogler asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the music. The breakthrough was significant. Over the next 2 hours, Vogler provided detailed information about remaining German defenses, the locations of SS units most likely to resist surrender, and insights into the chain of command that remained operational. The information would potentially save thousands of lives on both sides by allowing American forces to bypass heavily defended positions and target command structures precisely. When the interrogation was complete, Vogler seemed physically and emotionally exhausted, as if the collapse of his ideological defenses had drained him entirely. As he was being prepared for transport to division headquarters, Vogler hesitated, then turned to Wilson. "Lieutenant," he said, "may I ask you a personal question?" Wilson nodded. Why do you fight for America when you are not? He struggled to formulate the question delicately. When we are not treated as equals there, Wilson finished for him. Vogler nodded uncomfortably. Wilson considered the question seriously. Because America, for all its flaws, is built on principles worth fighting for, even when it fails to live up to them. The words, "all men are created equal," were written by a slave owner, but the words themselves are true regardless of the author's hypocrisy. I fight for what America can be, not just what it is. Vogler absorbed this, then asked, "And what will you do after the war?" "Continue the fight at home," Wilson replied simply. "Different battlefield, same principles." As Vogler was led away, Reynolds approached Wilson. "Do you think he really understood?" Wilson watched the German general's retreating figure. "I think we cracked the foundation of everything he believed about race. Whether he can rebuild a new worldview from those ruins, that's up to him." The final day of their operation in Wernigerode brought an unexpected development. A group of German civilians, led by the town's mayor, approached the American perimeter under a white flag. Wilson and Hayes went to meet them, curious about their purpose. The mayor, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, addressed them nervously in German. "We have heard that there are American Negro soldiers who speak German," he explained. "Is this true?" Wilson confirmed it. "Several of us speak German, yes. I'm Lieutenant Wilson, and this is Private Hayes." The mayor seemed both relieved and anxious. "Then perhaps you can help us. There is a situation in the town that we are uncertain how to handle with the changing authorities." Wilson raised an eyebrow. "What situation?" "During the war," the mayor continued hesitantly, "there were some foreign workers brought to our town to work in the factories, forced laborers. Among them were several black men from France, colonial troops who had been captured in 1940. Wilson exchanged a glance with Hayes. The use of POWs and forced laborers in German industry was a known issue, but they hadn't expected to encounter it directly in this small town. "Where are these men now?" Wilson asked. "Still here," the mayor replied. "Hidden in a farm outside town. The local Nazi Party official who supervised them fled 3 days ago before your arrival. The farm family has been feeding them but is afraid, both of punishment for harboring them and of what might happen when your troops discover them." "How many men are we talking about?" Hayes asked. 7, the mayor said. "All from Senegal originally, we believe." Wilson made a quick decision. "Take us to them now." 30 minutes later, Wilson and Hayes, accompanied by Reynolds and a medical officer, followed the mayor's car to a small farm 2 kilometers outside Wernigerode. The farmhouse was a traditional German structure with a red-tiled roof and whitewashed walls, surrounded by fields that showed signs of recent planting despite the war. An elderly German couple greeted them anxiously at the gate. The woman wrung her hands in her apron, while the old man stood protectively beside her. "We did nothing wrong," the old man said immediately in German. "We only gave them food and shelter after Herr Kleinmann ran away." "No one is accusing you of anything," Wilson assured him. "We're here to help these men." The farmer nodded reluctantly and led them to a barn behind the house. Inside, 7 black men in ragged clothing rose cautiously to their feet as the Americans entered. They were thin and showed signs of malnourishment and hard labor, but their eyes lit with hope at the sight of black American soldiers. One of them stepped forward and addressed Wilson in French. "You are Americans. The war is over." Hayes, whose French was limited, translated the basic question for Wilson, who nodded. "Yes, we're Americans," Wilson replied in English, gesturing to his uniform. "The war is nearly over. Germany has lost." Reynolds, who spoke some French from his jazz days in Paris, stepped forward. "Nous sommes Américains," he said. "Vous êtes libres maintenant." The announcement that they were free now brought visible emotion to the faces of the 7 men. The spokesman, who introduced himself as Sergeant Mamadou Diallo of the French colonial forces, explained their situation in a mixture of French and broken German. They had been captured during the fall of France in 1940, initially held as regular POWs, but later separated from white French prisoners and sent to work in German factories. For the past 2 years, they had been forced laborers in Wernigerode's small armaments factory, working 12-hour shifts under harsh conditions with minimal food. When American forces approached, the Nazi Party official in charge of the factory had ordered the execution of all foreign workers to eliminate witnesses to their treatment. But the factory foreman had balked at the order and instead told the workers to flee. The Senegalese soldiers, conspicuous in the German countryside, had been hidden by the elderly farm couple, an act of considerable courage given the potential consequences. As Reynolds communicated with Diallo, Wilson spoke quietly with the German farmers. "Why did you help them?" he asked directly. "You must have known the risk you were taking," the old woman answered before her husband could speak. "They are someone's sons," she said simply. "We have a son who was taken prisoner by the Russians in 1943. We pray someone there shows him kindness as well." The human connection transcending national and racial boundaries struck Wilson powerfully. Even amid the racial hatred that Nazi ideology had cultivated, this simple act of compassion had persisted. The medical officer examined the Senegalese men and determined they needed proper nutrition and rest, but had no serious medical conditions requiring immediate hospitalization. Wilson made arrangements for them to be transported to an American field hospital for recovery before repatriation to France. As they prepared to leave, Sergeant Diallo approached Wilson. Through Reynolds' translation, he asked a question that caught Wilson off guard. "He wants to know if black soldiers are treated equally in the American army," Reynolds translated, looking uncomfortable. Wilson hesitated, torn between patriotic instinct and honesty. "Tell him we serve in segregated units," he finally said. "We fight the same enemy, but not always side by side with white troops. We're fighting for a better future, both here and at home." When Reynolds translated this, Diallo nodded with understanding. "C'est la même chose partout," he said sadly. "It is the same everywhere." "Not forever," Wilson replied firmly, asking Reynolds to translate. "Not if men like us continue to fight for change after this war ends." As they escorted the freed prisoners back to their base, Wilson reflected on the connections this small German village had revealed between black Americans and Germans, between German civilians and African prisoners, between military duty and human compassion. The neat categories of ally and enemy, oppressor and oppressed, seemed to blur at the edges when examined closely. That evening, as the 614th prepared to transfer control of Wernigerode to a regular infantry unit and move forward with the advance, Wilson met with his German-speaking team one final time to review their experiences. "We've accomplished something significant here," Wilson told them. "Not just the military objective or the intelligence gathered, but something more fundamental." "A crack in the master race theory," Hayes suggested. "Every German who heard us speak their language perfectly had to confront the contradiction between what they'd been taught and what they experienced directly." Reynolds nodded. "I saw it in their faces, that moment of recognition of having to reorganize their entire understanding of race." "But will it last?" Jackson asked pragmatically. "After we're gone, how easy will it be for them to slip back into old ways of thinking?" Wilson considered this. "Some will, but others won't be able to unhear what they heard or unsee what they saw. Ideas can be as powerful as bullets, sometimes more so." "And what about us?" Hayes asked quietly. "We go back to a segregated America after fighting for freedom over here." The question hung in the air, one they had all contemplated but rarely discussed openly. "We go back changed too," Wilson finally said. "With new perspectives, new confidence, new evidence of our own capabilities, and perhaps most importantly, with new allies, white Americans who have fought alongside us and seen what we can do. The war at home for equality will be longer than this one, but I believe it's winnable." Reynolds raised his coffee cup in a toast. "To fighting on two fronts and winning on both." The others joined the toast, united by their shared experiences and the bonds formed through their unique position at the intersection of language, race, and war. The next morning, as they prepared to depart Wernigerode, Hauptmann Müller approached Wilson as he was supervising the loading of vehicles. "Lieutenant," Müller called, standing at a respectful distance under the watchful eye of an American guard. Wilson walked over, curious about what the German officer wanted. "We're being transported to the POW camp today," Müller said. "I wanted to thank you for the fair treatment we've received." Wilson nodded, acknowledging the gratitude, but sensing there was more. Müller hesitated, then continued, "I've been thinking about our conversations, about Goethe and poetry and the ideas I accepted without question for too many years." "And?" Wilson prompted when Müller paused. "And I wanted you to know that when I return to civilian life, when Germany begins to rebuild, I will remember. I will teach my students, if I'm allowed to teach again, to question such ideas, to recognize our common humanity." It was a small promise from one man, but Wilson recognized its significance. "That's all anyone can ask, Hauptmann, to learn from history and try to build something better." Müller nodded solemnly. "Auf Wiedersehen, Lieutenant Wilson." "Auf Wiedersehen, Herr Müller," Wilson replied, wondering if their paths would ever cross again in peacetime. As the convoy of the 614th Tank Destroyer Battalion pulled out of Wernigerode later that day, Wilson looked back at the medieval town with its half-timbered houses and ancient church spires. In just 3 days, something profound had happened here. Not a major battle or strategic victory, but a series of human connections that had challenged deeply held beliefs on both sides. The war was entering its final weeks. Berlin would fall soon, and the Third Reich would collapse entirely. But Wilson understood that the defeat of Nazi Germany on the battlefield was only the beginning of the longer struggle against the ideology of racial hatred and supremacy that had fueled it. As their vehicles climbed into the Harz Mountains toward their next objective, Wilson thought about the men of the 614th and the unique weapon they had wielded in this war. Not just their tank destroyers and rifles, but their minds, their education, their cultural knowledge, and their ability to shatter preconceptions through the simple act of speaking German. The full significance of these cultural exchanges would not be immediately apparent in the grand narrative of World War II. There would be no medals awarded for changing minds, no monuments erected to commemorate moments of recognition and respect across racial lines. But in the long struggle for human dignity and equality, both in post-war Germany and in America, these moments would matter. 3 months later, after Germany's surrender, Wilson found himself at a processing center near Frankfurt, preparing for his unit's return to the United States. The men of the 614th had fought with distinction through the final weeks of the European campaign, earning commendations for their courage and effectiveness. Now they faced the complicated prospect of returning to a homeland where their status as heroes would not translate into equality. As Wilson completed paperwork in an administrative office, a familiar voice called his name. He looked up to see Thomas Reynolds, now promoted to staff sergeant, approaching with an envelope in hand. "Lieutenant, this came for you through division headquarters," Reynolds said, handing over the envelope. "Apparently it's been trying to find you for weeks." Wilson examined the envelope, surprised to see his name written in elegant German handwriting. There was no return address. He opened it curiously and unfolded a letter written in German on thin paper. "Dear Lieutenant Wilson," it began, "I hope this letter finds you well as the war has now concluded. You may not remember me, but our conversation in Wernigerode in April made a profound impression that I cannot forget." Wilson continued reading with growing astonishment. The letter was from Hauptmann Karl Müller, writing from a POW camp in France. Müller explained that he had been thinking continuously about their discussions regarding race, culture, and humanity. He described how his encounters with Wilson and the other German-speaking black soldiers had forced him to confront the contradictions in Nazi racial ideology, contradictions that had been troubling him subconsciously even before their meeting, but which he had suppressed out of fear and conformity. Müller wrote that he had begun teaching English and literature to other prisoners in the camp, using it as an opportunity to subtly challenge the racial preconceptions many still held. He hoped to return to teaching after his eventual release and was committed to helping build a different kind of Germany, one that had learned the hard lessons of the Third Reich's hateful ideology. The letter concluded with a request that surprised Wilson even more than the letter itself. "If it would not be too much trouble, I would be honored if we could maintain a correspondence after you return to America. I believe we both face the task of rebuilding societies damaged by racial hatred, you in America with its segregation, and I in a Germany that must confront its recent past honestly. Perhaps by sharing our experiences and thoughts, we might each be more effective in this important work. Müller had included an address where he could receive mail after his anticipated release from the POW camp in the coming months. Reynolds watched Wilson's expression as he read. "Good news?" Wilson looked up, still processing the unexpected letter. "I think so. It's from that German officer we captured in Wernigerode, the one who was so shocked that we spoke German." "The literature professor," Reynolds remembered. Wilson nodded. "He wants to correspond after the war, about building societies without racial hatred." Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "From enemy to pen pal in 3 months, that's something." "It's more than that," Wilson said thoughtfully. "It's evidence that people can change, that confronting prejudice directly can actually work." "You going to write back?" Reynolds asked. Wilson carefully folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. "Yes, I think I will. We're going to need allies everywhere for the fights ahead, even in unexpected places." As the men of the 614th prepared to return to an America still deeply divided by race, the connections they had forged through their language abilities and cultural knowledge represented small but significant bridges across the chasms of prejudice. The war had changed them, and they had changed others in turn. The full impact of these transformations would unfold gradually in the post-war years, as both Germany and America confronted their relationships with racial hatred and human equality. The story of the black GIs who spoke German would not appear prominently in official histories of World War II, but for those who experienced these encounters firsthand, both Americans and Germans, they represented moments of profound recognition that transcended propaganda and prejudice. In these small human connections lay the seeds of larger transformations that would shape the post-war world. Years later, when asked about his most significant contribution to the war effort, Lieutenant James Wilson would not mention combat actions or strategic victories. Instead, he would describe the look on a German officer's face when poetry and language revealed their shared humanity across the artificial barriers of race, a moment when words became more powerful than weapons in dismantling the foundations of hatred. 5 years after the war, in the autumn of 1950, Wilson received an unexpected package from Germany. Inside was a newly published book of essays titled Reflections on Humanity by Dr. Karl Müller, now a professor of literature at the University of Heidelberg. The book was inscribed with a simple message: "To Lieutenant Wilson, who taught me that true education begins when we question what we think we know. With deepest respect and gratitude, Karl Müller." Wilson leafed through the book, noting with satisfaction that several essays directly addressed the poisonous nature of racial ideology and the importance of recognizing human dignity across cultural and racial differences. Müller had kept his promise from that day in Wernigerode. He was using his position as an educator to challenge the prejudices that had fueled the Nazi regime. The correspondence between Wilson and Müller continued sporadically over the years, bridging continents and cultures. Wilson, who had returned to academia himself as a professor of German literature at Howard University after the war, often shared Müller's letters with his students as examples of how personal connections could transcend historical enmity and ideological divides. In 1955, as the civil rights movement in America gained momentum, Wilson received another letter from Müller that resonated deeply. "My dear friend," Müller wrote, "I follow the struggles in your country with great interest and no small amount of painful recognition. The parallels to our own historical moment are impossible to ignore, a society confronting its fundamental contradictions, the gulf between stated principles and lived reality. Yet I find hope in knowing that men like you are engaged in this struggle, just as you were during the war. The weapons are different, but the cause is the same: human dignity and equality. I have not forgotten the lesson you taught me in Wernigerode, that education is the most powerful force against hatred. I continue to teach this to my students, and I see in their eyes the same recognition I experienced that day with you." Wilson shared this letter with his colleague, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., during a faculty meeting at Howard. King was struck by the international resonance of their struggle and later incorporated the concept of transformative personal encounters across racial lines into several of his speeches. The impact of the 614th's unique approach to interrogation extended beyond Wilson and Müller. Many of the German soldiers and officers who encountered Black American troops who spoke their language carried those experiences with them into post-war German society. The cognitive dissonance created by these encounters forced a re-evaluation of racial assumptions that contributed in small but meaningful ways to Germany's post-war reckoning with Nazi ideology. Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, who had returned to his musical career after the war, toured West Germany with his jazz quartet in 1956. During a performance in Hamburg, he was approached by a middle-aged German man who introduced himself hesitantly. "Sergeant Reynolds, you may not remember me, but I was a corporal in Wernigerode in 1945. You played a Louis Armstrong record during our interrogation and spoke of performing at Haus Vaterland before the war." Reynolds was astonished that the man had recognized him after more than a decade. "I remember," he said, extending his hand. "Weber, wasn't it?" The German nodded, clearly moved that Reynolds recalled his name. "I wanted you to know that our conversation that day changed something in me. When our party leaders spoke of racial purity and superiority, I had no reason to question it. But after meeting you, hearing you speak our language, sharing music, I could never again accept such ideas." Weber explained that he had become a music teacher after the war and had defied the lingering prejudices in German society by introducing his students to jazz and its African-American roots. "I tell them about you," he said, "about how music transcends the barriers we create between people." Similar stories emerged throughout the post-war years. Marcus Hayes, whose Bavarian-accented German had so disconcerted the German officers, returned to Milwaukee after the war and established a cultural exchange program between American and German students. Several of the German officers he had interrogated eventually brought their own students to participate in the program, creating a cycle of cross-cultural understanding that continued for generations. Corporal Elijah Jackson, the mechanic whose technical German had impressed the Wehrmacht engineers, used his wartime experiences to help establish vocational training programs for Black veterans returning from the war. His ability to navigate both technical and cultural barriers became a model for creating opportunities in fields previously closed to Black Americans in the post-war industrial boom. In 1965, 20 years after their encounter in Wernigerode, Lieutenant James Wilson, now Professor Wilson with silver at his temples, received an invitation to speak at the University of Heidelberg as part of a conference on literature and human understanding. The invitation came from Professor Karl Müller, who had risen to become the department chair and a respected voice in Germany's ongoing process of confronting its Nazi past. The reunion of the former enemies, now friends and colleagues, attracted attention from both German and American media. A photograph of Wilson and Müller standing together on the steps of the ancient university, deep in conversation, appeared in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic, a powerful symbol of reconciliation and shared humanity. During his address to the conference, Wilson reflected on their first meeting 2 decades earlier. "When Hauptmann Müller and I first spoke in April 1945, we did so across a divide created by war ideology and the artificial construct of race," Wilson told the audience. What bridged that divide was not political negotiation or military victory, but something far more fundamental: the recognition of our shared humanity through language, literature, and culture. When we quoted Goethe to each other in that makeshift interrogation room, we momentarily stepped outside the roles assigned to us by history and politics. We became simply 2 men who appreciated the same poetry, who had walked the same streets in Berlin before the war, who could see in each other the reflection of our common human experience. Müller, listening from the front row, nodded in agreement, his eyes bright with emotion. "This is the power of cultural understanding," Wilson continued. "It creates moments of recognition that can crack even the most rigid ideological frameworks. When faced with direct evidence that contradicts our prejudices, when the person we've been taught to view as other reveals themselves to be as human, as complex, as familiar as ourselves, We must either reject the evidence or reject the prejudice. In that moment in Wernigerode, Hauptmann Müller chose to reject the prejudice, beginning a journey that has led him and Germany toward a more humane understanding of our shared world. The lecture received a standing ovation, but perhaps the most significant moment came later that evening, during a small dinner held in Wilson's honor. An elderly German gentleman approached their table, introducing himself as General Major, retired, Heinrich Vogler. "Professor Wilson," Vogler said formally, "I do not expect you to remember me, but—" "I remember you very well, General," Wilson interrupted with a smile. "You were quite surprised when 4 black American soldiers addressed you in different dialects of German." Vogler nodded, a look of wonder crossing his face at Wilson's recall. "I have often thought of that day, of how completely unprepared I was for the experience. In all my military training, in all the psychological preparation for possible capture, no one had considered the possibility of black American interrogators who spoke perfect German. It was devastating to my worldview." "And now," Wilson asked gently. "Now I speak to youth groups about the dangers of racial ideology," Vogler replied. "I use my own experience as an example of how deeply we can be deceived by such thinking and how transformative it can be to have those deceptions challenged directly." The elderly general hesitated, then added, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the fair treatment during captivity, but for the gift of that cognitive dissonance, as uncomfortable as it was at the time. It forced me to begin questioning everything I had accepted without thought during the Nazi years." As Wilson listened to Vogler's words, he reflected on how the seeds planted in those brief interactions 20 years earlier had grown in ways none of them could have anticipated. The German-speaking soldiers of the 614th had not just gathered military intelligence during those interrogations, they had initiated a process of transformation that continued to ripple outward through individual lives and broader societies. The story of the black GIs who spoke German was, in many ways, a microcosm of the larger challenges facing both post-war Germany and civil rights-era America. The difficult process of confronting deeply entrenched prejudices through direct experience and human connection. It demonstrated that while laws and policies were essential for structural change, the most profound transformations often began with moments of personal recognition across the artificial barriers of race. In the decades that followed, as both Germany and America continued to navigate their complex relationships with racial equality and human dignity, the lessons of those encounters in Wernigerode remained relevant. The power of education, language, and cultural understanding to challenge prejudice offered a model for addressing the persistent legacy of racial ideologies in both societies. For James Wilson, Karl Müller, and the others whose lives had intersected briefly in that small German town in April 1945, the experience had demonstrated a profound truth that even amid the dehumanizing context of war, authentic human connections could emerge that transcended the categories of ally and enemy, revealing the shared humanity that no ideology could ultimately deny. When Wilson finally retired from teaching in 1975, he donated his correspondence with Müller to the Howard University archives as a testament to the possibility of transformation through cultural understanding. The collection became a valuable resource for scholars studying the psychological impact of World War II on racial attitudes and the transnational dimensions of the civil rights movement. The final letter in the collection, dated 1973, captured the essence of their unlikely friendship and its broader significance. "My dear Wilson," Müller wrote, "as I approach the end of my teaching career, I find myself reflecting on the strange paths that lead us to our most important insights. Who could have imagined that a military interrogation in the final days of a catastrophic war would prove to be the most educationally significant moment of my life? Yet it was precisely there, confronted by you and your colleagues, men I had been systematically taught to view as inferior, but who demonstrated intellectual and cultural capabilities that equaled or exceeded my own, that my true education began. Everything that followed, my work in denazification, my teaching, my writing on cultural understanding, flows from that moment of recognition. For this profound gift, I remain eternally grateful." Wilson's reply, the last document in the archive, offered a fitting conclusion to their decades-long exchange. "My dear Müller, your letter moved me deeply. If our brief encounter in Wernigerode played some role in your journey, I am honored to have been part of it. But I believe the capacity for that recognition was already within you, a willingness to see beyond the categories imposed by ideology to the human reality before you. That capacity exists in all of us, though too often dormant or suppressed by the powerful forces of prejudice and conformity. Perhaps that is the most important lesson of our unusual friendship, that even in the darkest moments of human history, the possibility of recognition, understanding and transformation remains alive. As I look at the world our students will inherit, with its ongoing struggles against various forms of hatred and division, I find hope in remembering what happened in a small German town when people truly saw each other across the artificial barriers of race. That possibility remains our greatest resource in building the more humane world we both have sought to create through our teaching and friendship. The story of the black GIs who spoke German reminds us that in the midst of humanity's darkest chapter, small moments of recognition across racial and cultural divides carried the seeds of transformation. While the grand narratives of World War II focus on military strategies and political outcomes, these human encounters represent a different kind of victory, the triumph of recognition over prejudice, of shared humanity over ideological division. For Lieutenant James Wilson, Sergeant Thomas Reynolds, Corporal Elijah Jackson, and Private Marcus Hayes, their fluency in German proved to be more than a tactical advantage in military interrogations. It became a powerful demonstration that education, culture, and human connection could challenge even the most deeply entrenched racial ideologies. In speaking the language of their enemies, they created moments of recognition that transcended the categories of war and opened pathways toward a more humane understanding. As we reflect on their story today, we are reminded that the most profound challenges to prejudice often come not through abstract arguments, but through direct experiences that force us to confront the contradictions in our preconceptions. When Hauptmann Karl Müller heard a black American officer quote Goethe in perfect German, or when General Major Heinrich Vogler was addressed in his native Bavarian dialect by a soldier his ideology had classified as inferior, the foundations of Nazi racial theory began to crumble, not through military defeat alone, but through the irrefutable evidence of shared humanity. The legacy of these encounters lives on in the ongoing work of building societies that recognize the fundamental dignity and equality of all people. It reminds us that while laws and policies are essential for structural change, the journey toward true equality begins with moments of recognition across the artificial barriers we create between human beings, moments that reveal our common humanity and challenge us to question what we think we know about others and ourselves. In the end, the story of the black GIs who spoke German is not just a footnote in the military history of World War II, but a powerful illustration of how cultural understanding can become a force for transformation, even in the most unlikely circumstances. It stands as a testament to the enduring power of education, language, and human connection to challenge prejudice and create pathways toward a more just and equitable world. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.